So lengthened partials have been all the rage over the past year or two in the world of hypertrophy training, and I decided to delve into them myself, not by looking into the research, boring, but by doing them myself.
Do it!
Do it.
Do it.
So for 30 days in my own training, I did nothing but lengthen partials. And so this is not a scientific study. I'm not doubting the studies or debunking the studies. It is simply my own personal experience. So we're going to get into the bad, the good, and the I'm going to talk about my recommendations as well as my full results from the entire month of training. So let's start with the bad, just because I find that to be more interesting. On some movements, it was a little bit difficult to track exactly where I should stop. And I almost felt like I was holding back at times. So when I was doing, say, a chest supported row, okay, I'm using a heavier weight because it's a lengthened partial, but I also have to stop at a certain point because it's a lengthened partial. And I felt like I was really holding back compared to a normal set. Normally when I do a set of chest supported rows or Helms rows or cable rows, I'm pulling as hard as I can the whole way. So at the start, I'm pulling hard, mid-range pulling hard, and at the end, I'm pulling hard as well. But with a lengthened partial, it's almost like I had to de-accelerate partway through so that I didn't pull too far. Same thing with something like a leg press. With these bottom range lengthened partials, I felt like if I pushed too hard, I would go up too high past the sticking point. And so I had to kind of hold back. And that just didn't seem very effective or productive, and it just felt weird. If something is holding you back from giving a great effort, to me, I'm not sure how that would be better for hypertrophy. It also was a little bit difficult to tell proximity to failure, because again, normally with, say, a leg press, you're blasting through the sticking point. Oh, it's getting slower, it's getting slower. There's this predictable slowing as you get close to failure. But with a lengthened partial, that was a lot more difficult to do. There also were some practical difficulties here on some movements. On some machines, they just didn't really go heavy enough in order to challenge the lengthened position. Maybe with a full range of motion for higher reps, they were suitable, like a leg extension. But because it was so easy in that lengthened position, I would have gone heavier than the machine could have allowed. Same thing for dumbbells. My gym only goes up to 50 kilos. I actually got adjustable dumbbells where you can put plates on this. I haven't used them though because they arrived too late. Also, you're going to want to use straps for a lot of stuff. If your grip is giving out because you're going very, very heavy, that might be an issue. I also found that they were a little bit more difficult on the elbows because you are going so much heavier. And on some movements, it was almost like the limiting factor is your ability to start the movement and get that initial elbow bend on some rows and vertical pulls. I also felt on some movements that the limiting factor switched from becoming the muscle that I wanted to target to something else, either another muscle or the ability to breathe or brace. For instance, on RDLs, I built up to 130 kilos for 6 on lengthened partials, basically going just above the floor to the knee, to the floor, to the knee, to the windows, to the walls for 6 reps. However, with full range of motion and a pause at the bottom, I've done 130 kilos for 15 reps. And without a pause, I've done it for 22 reps. And so on some movements, the limiting factor was more just your ability to brace. When you do a full range of motion RDL, above the knees, it's not as challenging. And so it kind of gives you an opportunity to rebreathe, to rebrace, to find a rhythm. And if doing full range of motion gets you a better overall performance and actually more time in that lengthened phase, I would say full range of motion is probably going to be the better option. I also thought this was pretty much trash for barbell squats, where you go all the way down, you pause ass to grass, you go part way up, then all the way down. And I felt like I was losing tension. I felt like it was just the ability to breathe and brace. I didn't even really feel anything in my quads. And so I think a super deep squat, maybe it's going to be more adductors, maybe more bracing. And so I don't think this is really going to be a good option. If you go with a full range of motion, if your performance is going to be much better, I think that is probably the way to go. I know that sounds like a lot of bad, and it is a lot of bad. Not every technique is going to be suitable for every exercise, so I think that's pretty expected. So let's switch to the okay. First, I thought leg presses were much better than squats because it kind of took the bracing aspect out of it, at least a little bit, a lot less technical. And so I felt like I could kind of get in a rhythm. I still ended up doing a little bit more range of motion than just a lengthened partial. Again, because I wanted to blast through the sticking point, I felt like that was a lot more productive than kind of going just before the sticking point, just before, and kind of holding back. That just did not feel particularly good. By the way, this video is sponsored by Boostcamp. So I don't care how lengthy you are, you need to be tracking your training. If you're not keeping a training log, you are probably leaving gains on the table. The idea that you can instinctively go in and progression will just magically happen, it'll just evaporate and appear from the ether is a pipe dream. And if you're going to track, you might as well use the best. Plus, you get access to some of the best programs out there. So if you're not really sure what to do, if you don't really want to write your own plan, hop on a fixed plan, and then you can maybe modify it over time as you realize what does work or doesn't work for you in the gym. So great option. Once again, thank you to Boostcamp for sponsoring this video. I also thought that for vertical presses and horizontal presses, it was okay. If you see a lot of bros do these movements, they don't fully lock out their presses like this because they often find that this is a lot of triceps. Same thing for bench press. They kind of keep it in that bottom range of motion and keep the tension on the chest. And so I ended up going a little bit more every single week because I felt, again, like going through that sticking point was the way to go. And so I think lengthened partials are fine, but for me, they kind of devolved into just training like a bro. And on most of these movements, unlike the RDLs, performance for full range of motion and lengthened partials was actually pretty similar. And I think that the outcomes would probably be pretty similar as well. The sets don't quite last as long because the reps are shorter because they're shorter, but you also are fatiguing more quickly because you're maybe not using other muscles or taking a short break at the top of the movement. So for me, these are kind of a wash, and I think you should probably go by feel. I do think that the very top of a press, either vertical or horizontal, you're probably not getting a lot from it. And this kind of explains why a lot of bros use this more rhythmic style of pressing where it is not fully locked out. All right, now let's talk about the good. And there is some good. I think there is some application here, and I think that you can implement these in your training in some cases. I think the biggest one is when you are targeting a range of motion that you don't really target with traditional big basic movements. For instance, a heavy lengthened partial cable lateral raise, you're targeting the side delt in a lengthened position, in a position that you don't really get with overhead presses or dumbbell lateral raises. And so I think going a bit heavier here and doing a lengthened partial and getting that full stretch is probably a fairly unique and novel stimulus for most people that could provide large benefit. Same thing with some kind of pull down with one arm where you're really trying to stretch the lat across your body around the rib cage in order to fully get it lengthened. With a pull-up, you're not fully lengthening the lat. The lat is not really stretched here. You have all this range of motion or all this range of motion that you can take if you want to. And because it is a bilateral movement, you just really can't fully stretch the lats and stress them in that lengthened position. And so again, this very much could be a novel stimulus. And I think this explains why the side and rear delts, as well as the back in general, people often report either cheating or having to use tons and tons of volume. And I think this is because the big basic movements performed with good form strictly, well, they just don't provide a lot of stimulus or any stimulus in that lengthened position. There also were a few arm movements that I really enjoyed lengthened partials on. Initially, I tried to do it on rope pushdowns, but I found that because I was using like 55, 60 kilos, it was kind of like pulling me out of position. So I ended up doing them with one arm at a time, which seemed fine. You know, got a nice sort of stretch across the body, Overhead extensions, same thing, not getting that full contraction, just kind of staying in this position. That felt pretty good as well. And then cable curls, where I had the cable behind me, I'm getting a full stretch, shoulders fully extended, and then I'm just curling up like that. I thought those were pretty good as well. However, keep in mind that taking the stretch to the extreme, I think is one, not only necessary, two, the research doesn't really support it, three, it can very quickly become impractical, where you're lying on a flat bench or even a decline bench and you're trying to do these little baby curls with baby weight because you reversed engineered a movement so that you could use the smallest possible amount of weight because you're emphasizing the stretch to an extreme degree. But now effectively the range of motion is only like this much because anytime you go over there, the weight flies up because now it's super easy. I think that is probably a waste of time. You'll likely get sore, especially if you haven't used that range of motion, but for long-term growth, I don't think this is particularly viable. So before I share my full results, I want to give you 10 recommendations. First, ease into these, especially if you haven't used a full range of motion. If you're getting a muscle into a position that it really has never gotten into before, you're going to want to take things slow, easy, gentle, ease into that position. Don't do anything crazy because you're just not used to that style of training. Second, on movements where the contracted position is easiest. So a barbell squat at the very top, easiest. Barbell bench press, the very top, easiest. You might want to cut out that part of the range of motion, particularly if other muscle groups are coming into play. So at the top of a bench press, it's notoriously triceps. So maybe just don't do that part of the range of motion and keep it on the chest. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. However, you probably want to go at least through the sticking point in order to guarantee a good effort and to make sure that you're not just getting stapled at the bottom when you're really tired and you realize, oh, actually, I can't get through the sticking point. So I would say at a minimum, get through the sticking point, but you don't need to go all the way up, especially if it's easy near the top. On the other hand, if it is easiest at the top, like an RDL, but when you only do the lengthened position, your performance absolutely tanks, it might be worth doing that contracted part, if only to re-brace and get ready for that next foray into the lengthened position. Number three, if the contracted position is the most difficult, either do full range of motion and then beyond failure either with partials or with cheated reps, or go heavier and do lengthened partials. I think both are viable. I think personally I will prefer going a little bit lighter and then going beyond failure just because I feel like I can give a better effort, but I think both are viable here. Now, can you combine lengthened partials with cheated reps? I wouldn't, although I did at times. I think this gets you probably the most possible stimulus. You look at someone like Branch Warren, he's doing lengthened partials and cheated reps and sometimes partner assisted as well. I mean, to me, this is probably the holy grail of stimulus. You're getting just this massive stretch with huge weights and you're getting other muscles involved on the concentric. So you're really overloading that eccentric and the stretch. However, I think for most people, if you're just a hobbyist, the risk of injury is just going to be too high. And so it's tough for me to give that as a blanket recommendation. I think it's a possibility maybe when you're more advanced, if you're very resilient, but for most people, probably not worth doing. Also keep in mind, you can do both lengthened partials and a more full range of motion. So you can do something like a top set with a lengthened partial, quite a bit heavier, then you drop the weight, and for your back down sets, you use a more full range of motion. I would have the mentality of the weight dictates the form, not the form dictating the weight. So don't say, oh, I want to use this much range of motion, and then you try to find out a weight that can allow you to do that. No, you pick a weight that is reasonable based on your experience. You're going to have to play around with this, and then you just pull for all you're worth. You use as much range of motion as you can. This is going to ensure a quality effort every single rep and every single set. And if that range of motion decreases during the set, I see nothing wrong with that at all. In fact, that's probably the best possible option if you really want to maximize your stimulus. 6, if performance is better with full range of motion, you almost certainly should go full range of motion, especially if it's much better. Again, RDLs, 6 reps with partials versus 15 with paused versus 22 with full range of motion. To me, it's just so obvious that the full range of motion is going to be better overall, just because you're doing a lot more work, not just in that lengthened position, but more work overall. And so I think that is the way to go, particularly if breathing or bracing or positioning is going to be a limiting factor when you're staying in that lengthened position. Number 7, one thing I noticed is that for higher reps, performance was a lot better with lengthened partials. So you drop down the weight a little bit and suddenly you can just get in a rhythm and bang out reps. And because the range of motion is a lot less, you can kind of just get in a groove and smash out reps. But if you increase the weight just a little bit, you can't. And this might be unique to me because I am just better at reps in general. But I think this is probably going to be common to a lot of people where lengthened partials are just more rep friendly. So I wouldn't do a set of 5 with lengthened partials in most cases. This is probably more of like a 10 to 15 and up kind of situation. Number 8, the transition back to normal training might be a little bit weird, especially if you do them for a long time. So if you do dumbbell bench presses in the bottom part of the range of motion and then you switch back to full range of motion, you might find that the top position feels a little bit weird, especially if you haven't been doing it at all. On something like a leg press, I would say this is less of a concern because you're using full range of motion for that last rep to get it all the way up anyway. Same thing for, let's say, an incline barbell bench press. Well, you're starting at the top and then doing your partials, and then you're doing the last rep all the way up. So I would say for those, it's less of a concern. But if you're doing a movement in that bottom position and you're never going to the top, to that contracted position, I would say that you just might not be training that contracted position at all. Strength is specific. And even if you gain muscle from a certain part of the range of motion, it might not carry over in terms of performance or strength to that contracted position. So be ready for that. Number 9, ultimately, the fundamentals of training are way, way more important than lengthened partials. I think they have been very, very overhyped. Not by Milo Wolf, by the way, because he's like the lengthened partial guy. I think he's been pretty reasonable. But you see other people where they just take it, oh, you got to get a stretch. Stretch is all that matters. Like, oh, do your lengthened partials. I think there are massive downsides that haven't really been talked about and that I didn't even really know about before I did this. So the fundamentals of training, progressive overload, proximity to failure, and volume, those are going to be way, way more important. And in that order, by the way. So progressive overload, if you're doing lengthened partials, you still have to be progressively overloading. And that is going to be way more important than the specific range of motion that you use. After that, proximity to failure. You still have to be working really, really fucking hard. And these are not an excuse to not train hard. And then third, volume still matters. So don't think you're going to be doing like, oh, I did 1 set of lengthened partials. That's worth more than a bunch of sets of full range of motion. No, not necessarily. So progressive overload, most important. Proximity to failure, second to that. And then volume, also very, very important. And then you have stuff like lengthened partials. So keep in mind, this is at least 1 tier, maybe several tiers below those 3 big rocks. Number 10, if lengthened partials get your DH, to me, that is totally fine. If that gets you fired up and ready to train, ready to go in the gym, gets you excited about training, especially if you're more advanced and maybe the fire is, it's in the embers. Oh, you're not sure if you're making those gains. Let's do lengthened partials. To me, that's totally fine. I think it's a viable strategy, especially on some movements and some muscle groups. And so, again, if that gets you in the gym and excited, I think that is totally fine. Finally, for the moment you've been waiting for, drum roll, please, the results of the training in terms of measurements. So arm measurements, thigh measurements, chest measurements. The results were nothing. Yeah, nothing. I mean, I'm an advanced natural lifter and a month is really not very much time. And so gaining pretty much nothing measurable, maybe 1/8 of an inch here or there or something is pretty much expected. And I did not think that I was going to make massive gains, but I measured anyway because I've been doing that anyway. More about the fundamentals of training and how to get the most out of your time in the gym and your energy and your effort, check out my books. They will help a lot. They've been very, very highly reviewed. Thank you to everyone who has picked those up and has helped support the channel. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Peace.